Some folks seem to have already lived out the rest of their lives among dust and cattle, but sometimes fate drops a life into their hands, and from that moment on, nothing is ever the same. The land out in those Arizona hills didn't care if a man lived or died. Caleb Rowan had learned that truth the hard way. 12 years of dust and silence had carved lines into his face deeper than any plow could cut into soil. He wasn't a gunslinger, not anymore. He wasn't even the man who once rode into town with a smile and a future. Now he was just a rancher, feeding cattle, mending fences, listening to the wind scrape against the dry boards of a cabin that felt more like a tomb than a home. Every morning was the same. He'd rise before the sun, hear the echo of boots that weren't there anymore, and pour bitter coffee into a cracked tin cup. He never spoke the names of the family he'd buried because the earth had already claimed them, and words wouldn't bring them back. The cattle kept him alive, but barely. Survival wasn't living, it was a punishment. And yet, there was a storm always coiled tight inside him. Nights came heavy, filled with memories of screams and gunfire he couldn't forget, faces he couldn't save. Caleb told himself he didn't expect anything more from life. No neighbors, no visitors, no future, just the slow erosion of a man waiting to turn to dust with the hills around him. But out here, silence could turn treacherous in an instant. Sometimes the wind carried more than dust. Sometimes it carried the sound of hoofbeats where no horse should be, or the faint rustle of something or someone moving in the tree line. And Caleb, for all his solitude, never stopped keeping a shotgun near the door. Because he knew the West. He knew the way danger crept in quiet, how it always arrived when a man's guard was down. That evening, the sky burned red over the ridges, and Caleb felt it in his bones, the kind of unease a rancher learns not to ignore. He thought it was just another lonely night. He didn't know yet that before the sun rose again, someone would stumble out of the wilderness and tear his life wide open. The ridge had gone quiet, too quiet. Caleb Rowan leaned on the fence post, watching the cattle shuffle back into the corral, when he caught sight of something pale moving through the darkening line of pines. At first he thought it was a stray mule, or maybe the flash of a deer's belly disappearing into brush. But then it staggered, stumbled, and fell to its knees. Caleb froze. His hand went to the rifle slung across his shoulder, instinct older than his bones. Out here, anything that came crawling out of the tree line usually meant trouble. But when the figure rose again, dragging itself forward, the rifle lowered just a fraction. It wasn't a mule. It wasn't a man. It was a woman, barefoot, skin scraped raw, draped in nothing more than a filthy scrap of white cloth that might have once been a curtain or a shroud. Her hair hung in tangled ropes across her face. Her lips cracked like old leather. She staggered one more step, then collapsed in the dirt no more than 10 paces from him. For a heartbeat, Caleb didn't move. Years of silence had hardened him, taught him not to get tangled in other people's lives. But then he heard it. 2 words, ragged, torn from somewhere deeper than her lungs. "Please, don't." The sound gutted him. He crouched, careful as if approaching a wild animal. Her arms clutched the cloth tight to her chest, her body trembling like she'd been chased by devils straight out of hell. He whispered low, steady, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse. "Easy now." But when the cloth slipped from her shoulders, Caleb's breath caught in his throat. Her back was carved with fire and shame. Burns. Scars. Twisted letters scorched into her flesh as if some cruel hand had tried to brand its name into her very skin. For a moment, Caleb stumbled backward. Not from the wounds, but from the way she curled into herself, like she'd been trained to vanish, like she expected pain for simply existing. And just like that, Tennessee came roaring back. The war, the girl he couldn't save, the stare that had haunted him through a dozen empty years. Caleb swore once he'd never let it happen again. He shrugged off his coat, slow and steady, and draped it around her shoulders. Not as fabric, but as a vow. He lifted her, light as a broken bird, and carried her toward the cabin. Inside, the fire was already low. He laid her down gently on the cot, pulling the coat tight. She didn't speak, didn't move, except to grip the edge of that coat like it was stitched from safety itself. Caleb didn't ask questions. He wouldn't have known where to begin, and words could cut deeper than silence. So he built the fire higher, not for heat, but for sound, for the heartbeat it gave the cabin. Every creak outside made her flinch, every brush of wind against the shutters pulled her tighter into herself. Caleb busied his hands making coffee, bitter, strong, older than he cared to admit. He sat at the table pretending to drink, his eyes drifting toward the cot. She was still breathing, still alive. That had to count for something. Hours passed like years. Finally, her head turned. Her eyes, raw and hollow, locked with his. For a single heartbeat, a flicker of something human glimmered beneath the ruins of her pain. Caleb didn't speak. He only nodded, the way a soldier does when he sees a comrade barely holding the line. She turned back to the wall. But he knew. She hadn't given up completely. By dawn, her first word slipped out, cracked but clear. Water. Caleb handed her a cup. Careful, slow. No sudden moves. She drank, then stared at him longer than before. Not a plea, not gratitude. Just 3 unspoken words in her gaze. I'm still here. Caleb swallowed hard, because he knew. That single sip wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a storm. He thought the worst had passed. He thought the nightmare had ended at his doorstep. But outside those hills, men still rode. Men who carved symbols into women's skin. Men who didn't let their prey go free. And Caleb Rowan, for the first time in years, felt something burn inside him. A warning. A promise. He had no idea the real fight hadn't even begun. And now I'll ask you, what would you do if this woman stumbled into your world? Would you turn away? Or would you open the door? If this story gripped you, if it kept you on edge, then don't let it fade into silence. Like this story. Share it. And hit that subscribe button because what's coming next is darker, bloodier, and more unforgettable than anything you've heard so far. Out here in the West, stories don't end. They only sharpen. And the storm is just beginning. The days that followed were quiet, but not the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the sharp-edged quiet, the kind that made a man listen too hard to the creak of his own cabin walls. Caleb stayed close, his rifle leaning near the door, his eyes flicking toward the ridgeline every time the cattle shifted uneasily. Elena, he'd learned her name in pieces, whispered between ragged breaths, barely spoke. She lingered in the shadows of the cabin, drinking water, nibbling at bread, curling into that old coat as though it was the only shield she had left. But each day, Caleb noticed something. The way her eyes followed the light when the sun cut through the cracks in the wall. The way her hands trembled less when she lifted the cup. The way she sometimes sat by the fire long after he'd gone outside, staring at the flames like they were stitching her back together. Still, the scars on her back told a story no words could carry. Caleb didn't ask, but one evening, while he whittled a broken chair leg out on the porch, she stepped outside. Silent at first, watching the tree line as if expecting the devil himself to walk out of it. Then her voice cracked through the air, soft but steady. They used to make me clean their boots. Caleb didn't flinch. He kept carving, shaving curls of wood onto the porch. He knew the weight of words that came slow. There's a camp, not on any map, not lawful. Her eyes narrowed, locked on the horizon. Men work you till your bones crack, and when you fight back... She stopped, jaw tightening. They carve you up, like me. Caleb's knife paused. His gut churned, but he kept his silence. Sometimes the only answer a man could give was listening. Elena drew a breath sharp as broken glass. I ran. Twice. First time they broke my nose. Second time they branded me. Her hand brushed unconsciously against the coat wrapped around her. Third time, I made it this far. The sun dipped low, spilling fire across the trees. And with it came a sound that made Caleb's blood run cold. Hoofbeats, fast. Too fast for a drifting rider, too steady for a ranch hand. Caleb rose, chair leg forgotten, his body moving with an instinct he hadn't needed in years. He grabbed the shotgun propped by the door and glanced at Elena. Her face had gone pale as bone. She didn't need to be told what to do. She slipped inside the cabin, moving with the kind of practiced terror that came from surviving long enough to know when to hide. The rider appeared at the edge of the ridge, dust curling behind his horse like smoke from a burning field. He wasn't dressed like a cowboy. No spurs, no worn trail gear. Instead, a fancy vest clung to his chest, his slick mustache glistening with oil. He looked like a banker who'd lost his soul somewhere between the cards and the bottle. But when his eyes landed on the cabin, when his lips twisted into a cruel smile, Caleb knew. This man hadn't come for trade. He'd come to collect. Ellie Rose, the rider's voice cracked through the valley, sharp and mocking. You got one chance to come back quiet. Caleb stepped off the porch, shotgun in hand, boots grinding in the dirt. His voice was low, steady, carved from stone. She's not going anywhere. The man smirked, reins tightening in his hands. Ain't up to you, old-timer. Caleb cocked the shotgun, not pointed yet, but ready, the click echoing like thunder. This is my land. You turn that horse around, or you won't ride it back. For a long moment, the world held its breath. The horse pawed at the earth. The rider's eyes narrowed, calculating, cruel. Then he spat into the dust, swung his horse, and rode off slow. But the look he cast over his shoulder as he vanished down the ridge chilled Caleb to the marrow. That look said one thing clear. He'd be back, and next time, he wouldn't ride alone. The silence afterward was heavier than gunfire. Caleb lowered the shotgun, jaw tight. Inside, Elena hadn't moved from the cot. Her hands gripped his coat like she could hold the world together if she just clung tight enough. He sat on the porch long into the night, shotgun across his lap, eyes fixed on the dark trees. He knew men like that. Men who branded flesh, who thought of people as property. They didn't let go. They always came back. And when they did, the storm that followed would test everything: his rifle, his resolve, and the fragile chance at life that had just stumbled into his arms. 3 days passed. 3 long days where the world seemed to hold its breath. The ridge road stayed empty. The cattle grazed like nothing had changed, but Caleb Rowan felt it in his bones. That man with the greasy mustache hadn't left to forget. He'd left to gather. Caleb stayed close to the cabin, never straying far from the door. He didn't split wood, didn't check traps, didn't even ride fence. He just kept that shotgun clean, polished, and loaded, as if the steel itself knew the storm was waiting. Every creak of the windmill, every crow circling overhead, set his nerves taut as barbed wire. Elena sensed it too. She no longer hid in the corner like a ghost, but she moved quieter, her eyes flicking to the windows each time the wind shifted. She helped gather water, swept the dirt floor, even tried her hand at tending the stove. Small things, but her hands never stopped trembling. At night she woke with a jolt, eyes wild, whispering names that didn't belong to her. Caleb never asked. He just sat awake by the fire, listening, shotgun across his knees. By the third afternoon, the silence broke. The air turned still, the kind of still that smothered the land. Not a bird sang, not a cricket chirped. Then came the sound Caleb had been waiting for. Hoofbeats. Not one this time, not two, but 3. He stepped into the doorway, the barrel of the shotgun glinting in the waning light. Elena stood behind him, breath caught, eyes wide. Dust rose from the ridge road, and 3 riders cut through it like blades. The first was the same man from before, the banker-looking bastard, smirk carved deep on his face. Beside him rode 2 others, one lean, mean, with eyes like coals, the other broad-shouldered, hand already drifting near his belt. They rode like they owned the road, like they'd never been told no in their lives. The mustached man's voice rang out. "Step aside, old man. She comes back with us." Caleb didn't move. His boots stayed planted firm in the dirt. His voice was a low growl, steady as stone. "Not today." The second rider shifted in his saddle, hand brushing the butt of his pistol. Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. He didn't wait. The shotgun roared, the crack splitting the air like lightning. The man screamed, toppled from his horse, clutching a leg, pouring blood into the dust. The other 2 froze. Their smirks vanished, replaced by the kind of stillness only fear could bring. Horses stamped nervously, sensing the shift. Elena gasped behind Caleb, but she didn't scream. She knew better than anyone what came next. Then another voice cut through the standoff. Calm. Steady. A voice that carried authority like a badge long before you saw it. I'd think real hard about your next move, boys. From the tree line, a figure stepped out. Tall, broad, badge gleaming dull on his chest. Rifle slung low, but his stance needed no threat. Abram Hale, sheriff of the territory. And once, long ago, Caleb's brother-in-arms. The rider's eyes darted. The wounded man groaned in the dirt. The mustached leader cursed under his breath, but kept his hands clear of his pistol. Abram leveled his gaze, sharp as a blade. "This here's my jurisdiction," he said, "and she's under my protection now." No one moved. Dust drifted in the still air. Finally, the leader jerked his reins, spitting into the dirt. "This ain't over." He turned, the other rider dragging his wounded partner back into the saddle. Slowly, grudgingly, they retreated down the ridge road, fading into the haze. Only when the hoofbeats disappeared did Caleb lower his shotgun. His hands didn't shake. His jaw was tight, his eyes hollow. He'd been here before, on battlefields, in trenches, staring down men who thought cruelty was power. He knew the truth. Those men weren't gone. They'd regroup. They'd return. Abram stepped forward, studying Caleb with a faint, knowing smile. "You send a note that smells like gunpowder and regret," he said. "I figure it's serious." Caleb exhaled slow, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. "Thanks for coming." Abram's gaze shifted past him, to the cabin door. Elena stood there, the coat wrapped tight, her eyes wide but unbroken. For the first time, she wasn't cowering. She was standing, watching, bearing witness. The sheriff tipped his hat toward her, his tone gentler. "You're safe here. Long as I've got breath, long as he's got shells, no man drags you back to hell." Elena didn't speak. She only nodded, a flicker of something, trust, maybe, passing through her eyes. As the dust settled, the cabin grew quiet again. But it wasn't the heavy quiet of grief or loneliness anymore. It was a charged quiet, alive with the knowledge that this was just the beginning. Because men who carved scars into women didn't forgive. They hunted. They came back harder. And Caleb Rowan, for the first time in a dozen years, wasn't just waiting for the storm. He was ready to meet it head-on. The dust had barely settled when the night dropped over the hills, heavy and cold. Caleb Rowan sat on the porch long after Abram Hale had ridden back to town, his shotgun resting across his lap, eyes locked on the ridge. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Not empty, not haunted. It was the quiet that comes after blood has touched the dirt, when every man and beast in the valley knows the ground will remember it. Inside the cabin, Elna sat at the table, the sheriff's words still ringing in her ears. "You're safe here." She wanted to believe it. God, she wanted to. But safety was a word she hadn't tasted in so long that it felt foreign on her tongue. She wrapped Caleb's coat tighter, as if the smell of wood smoke and leather might shield her from the men who branded her like cattle. Caleb finally stepped inside, boots heavy on the plank floor. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He poured 2 tin cups of coffee, set one in front of her, and sat down across the table. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then, almost too soft to hear, Elna whispered, "They'll come back." Caleb nodded once, steady. "I know." Her eyes flicked to him, searching. She expected fear. She expected anger. What she found instead was resolve, cold and sharp, like iron pulled from a forge. For the first time since stumbling out of the trees, she felt the faintest flicker of something she thought she'd lost. Not safety. Not yet. But maybe a chance. The days that followed moved slow. Too slow. Elena began to help more, sweeping the porch, carrying water, even gathering wildflowers to set in a cracked jar by the window. Caleb noticed, though he never said a word. He found himself fixing things he hadn't cared about in years, mending the sagging fence, patching the holes in the roof, even sweeping the porch clean. 2 broken souls, circling around each other, each trying to stitch meaning back into days that had once been empty. But the shadows never let go. Elena still woke at night, gasping, sweat slick on her skin, her eyes wild. Caleb never asked what haunted her dreams. He just stoked the fire, sat close enough for her to know she wasn't alone, and waited until her breathing slowed. Sometimes she'd glance at him, eyes softening for just a heartbeat, before turning away. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, Elena carried in an armful of wildflowers. She set them by the window, their colors bright against the gray wood of the cabin. Caleb watched her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he fetched the broom and swept the porch until it was cleaner than it had been in years. Neither of them called it love. Neither of them dared. But both knew something was shifting. Then, over a simple dinner of stew and black coffee, Elena finally asked the question that lodged itself in Caleb's chest. You ever think, some folks aren't put here to save others, but just to give them space to save themselves? Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't. If he spoke, the wrong words might tumble out and shatter the fragile thread between them. So he just nodded, slow and steady, and Elena's lips curved into the faintest smile. Small, broken, but real. Yet outside, beyond the cabin walls, the storm hadn't passed. It was building. Men like the banker, men who branded skin and broke spirits, didn't walk away from defiance. They regrouped, they hunted, and they returned with fire and iron. Caleb knew it. Abram knew it. And deep down, Elena knew it too. This quiet, these fragile moments, they weren't an ending. They were a reprieve. A pause before the storm broke wide open. And when it came, it would test everything. Caleb's resolve, Elena's will to keep standing, and the fragile hope that had begun to root itself inside the walls of that old cabin. Now, let me ask you, how many Elenas are still out there, branded by pain, waiting for someone to stand between them and the darkness? And how many Calebs are sitting alone, thinking their story is over, until fate shoves a choice into their hands? If this story struck something inside you, don't let it fade. Hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for the next chapter. Because out here in the West, stories don't end. They only sharpen. And the storm is still coming. Out in the Arizona hills, silence was never truly silence. It carried echoes of the war Caleb Rowan thought he'd buried, of the screams Elena Rose thought she'd outrun. Together, in that weather-beaten cabin, they carved out something neither of them had expected. A fragile piece stitched from firelight, black coffee, and the stubborn will to keep breathing. But the West had its own way of testing people. It never gave second chances freely. Caleb knew the men who branded Elena weren't gone. They were circling like wolves, waiting for the moment to strike again. And Elena, though scarred, no longer curled into herself. She sat at the table each morning, eyes steady, spine unbroken. She had lived through fire once. If it came again, she would not face it alone. Maybe that was the truth of it all. Life in the West wasn't about salvation. It was about standing still when the storm rolled in, about choosing not to walk away when someone needed a shield. And when the dust rose again on that ridge road, one thing was certain. The fight ahead would not just decide their survival. It would decide what kind of people they were meant to be,